All right, gang, welcome back. We're talking about Chapter 15, the Federal Reserve. Our prior chapter, Economics, we were looking at some of the economic structures such as capitalism and socialism and how those impact the business environment. And here, Chapter 15, we're looking at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve controls the money supply for the United States. So not just the money supply, but also regulates the economy, trying to keep the economy in the sweet spot where it's not running too fast and overheating and creating inflation where prices are going up, and not being sluggish and slowing down to where we enter a recession. So they want to keep the economy healthy. The pictures up top are the chair people of the Federal Reserve. And I know they look like party people, people you want to hang out with, pretty serious position. They're basically the president of the US economy, managing the economy. On the right there, you have Jerome Powell, the current chairman of the Federal Reserve, appointed by President Trump. These are 4-year terms. They are appointed by the president, but the president cannot fire them. So but they are appointed. The picture on the left shows some of the prior chairmen of the Federal Reserve. They can serve multiple 4-year terms, unlike a president who's limited to 2 terms. On the far left, prior to Jerome Powell, you have Janet Yellen, the first and only female chairperson of the Federal Reserve, and she was appointed by Barack Obama. You have Alan Greenspan next to her with the glasses tilting to the side, and he was appointed by Reagan. And next to him, you have Ben Bernanke. Ben was appointed by George Bush. And then the tall elderly gentleman on the far right is Paul Volcker, and he was appointed way back with President Jimmy Carter. So some of these were Democratic president appointees, some of these were Republican appointees. The other thing I want to comment on regarding the legacy of the chairs of the Federal Reserve, especially in today's times when we're having more racial awareness and more awareness around the structures that drive our economy and our nation, all of the chairmen of the Federal Reserve have been white. We've had one woman, and then the rest are all primarily older white men. So I just say this is something to think about as business students, and wouldn't it be nice to see some different looking folks chairing the Federal Reserve? So that's the chairman of the Federal Reserve. The links on this slide, if you go to the Google Slides version of this presentation, not the video version, but the Google Slides version, links with additional information about the Federal Reserve. Your key terms are listed here. I have only one other slide, so this is a very short lecture, and you're not being quizzed on the key terms from this lecture. So this is extra information, but you're not being quizzed on this particular. So when I say the Federal Reserve controls the money supply, there's 3 tactics that they use to control the money supply. Right now, what they're using primarily is the third one on the column on the far left at the bottom, what they call the discount rate, or that's the interest rates. The Fed sets the federal funds rate. That's like the main federal bank. And then they lend money out to commercial banks who mark it up a little bit. They in turn lend it out to businesses and consumers. So our interest rates right now are an all-time low. It's very cheap to borrow money. And you can imagine that if you're a business or somebody, say, looking to buy a house, that low interest rates are attractive. So the Fed will use low interest rates to stimulate the economy. Because if it's cheap to borrow money, businesses are more likely to borrow money, and they're going to use that money to do things like buy new equipment, buy new plants, etc. And that's all money going into the economy, stimulating the economy. The other thing they can do on the far left column in this table, in the middle there, it says reserve requirements. So banks are required to keep a reserve. That is money that they can't lend out. So if you put money into a bank and that bank then turns around and uses that money to do car loans and home equity lines of credit, etc. But the reserve is the amount that they have to keep unlent. It has to just sit there in their own savings account. And when they raise the reserve requirement for banks, that means they can lend less money out and it slows down the economy. So they can lower the reserve requirement, which allows banks to put more money out into the economy. Then the other thing they can do is they can buy and sell bonds. So US bonds, government bonds, when they sell bonds, and maybe your grandpa buys you some bonds as an investment after you graduate high school, and when he bought those bonds, he gave the government money. So when people buy bonds, it's actually taking money out of the economy, and it slows things down. So that's why you see that called open market operations. The second column and the second row of that column sell government bonds. When the government sells bonds, that's the government selling bonds, not people. People buy that and it takes money out of the economy. So these are the main tactics that the Fed uses to control the money supply. The most powerful one of these three and the main tool that they use is to raise and lower interest rates. And they've been keeping interest rates low for quite some time. There is some current concern if you read some articles about the Federal Reserve and the current chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, that if you keep rates very low for a long time, it could actually create some inflationary pressure. But know those three different tactics. That's all for the Federal Reserve. Thanks for listening.